So we are reaching the end of our graphical user interface unit. We are going to continue on with the widgets program that we've been working on throughout the unit. Hopefully you've been following along. So if we review where we left off last time we had top level containers, not drawing very nicely, there we go. So we implemented a tab pane, and then I left it to you to play around with some of the other top level containers like split pane, scroll pane, etc. So hopefully you played around with that, you got a good understanding of that. Our last topic in graphical user interfaces is actually how to do something when the user presses on a button or types something into a text field. Right now our programs don't do anything. They look pretty, hopefully, but they don't do anything. So before we get into how to add stuff in for our button, I'm going to take a step back and remind you how we got our programs listening for keyboard events. Now, quick reminder, extends JFrame. Basically, when we say extends JFrame, we're copying and pasting everything from the JFrame class into our widgets class. Even though you don't see it copied and pasted, it's in there. So anything in the JFrame class, and if we go this dot, you see all these different functions, even though we haven't written them, or in all these variables that we have access to, we haven't declared some of them. This is all from the JFrame class. So basically what extends does means is we're copying and pasting the JFrame class, and we're going to extend it. We are going to continue working on where they left off on the JFrame class and make it do something specific to what we need it to do. That's what extends means. Now, there's an implements keyword. And a little bit of history, again, review from classes. Extends, if you work in other programming languages, most popular one being C++, they allow multiple inheritance. So if I want to inherit from multiple classes, so I wanted some sort of button listener, I would do comma, button listener, I can copy and paste from multiple classes at once. Java, in order to simplify the code, limited you to one. But to get around some issues that causes, they do implements, the implements keyword. And what implements does is it accesses special classes called abstract classes. Now, abstract classes have some code done, but they have some functions that have to still be written. That's why they're abstract. You can't just copy and paste from an abstract class. You wouldn't declare, so for example, for a regular class, I could, inside my JFrame project, create a new JFrame and then have two windows popping up. I could say J inside my constructor, I could say J.setVisible, set size, everything that we did for our widgets program, I could do with J and have two windows pop up. In fact, why don't we do that? So I'm going to say J.setVisible, true, J.setSize, J.setTitle, second. So if I run my program, I've got my widgets frame that pops up, and I've got my second frame that pops up. Okay, because frame is an actual class. Now, let me get rid of the stuff for J. You couldn't do that with an abstract class. Now, for an example of an abstract class that we had before, implements key listener. When we wanted to do a key listen for keyboard events, we did key listener. I couldn't say key listener J equals new key listener, because that class can't work on its own. And even if I add import, okay, it's going to say key listener is abstract, can't be instantiated. Means this class isn't meant to be an actual object. You have to do something with that key listener, and this explains why we have this error message: implement all abstract methods. And remember, I've always told you, if it says implement all abstract methods, it just means you made a deal with the operating system that you're going to have certain functions. For the key listener class, if we implement all of them, if you remember, it's key typed, key pressed, key released. If I wanted to do, and I can implement multiple abstract classes. If I want to do a mouse listener, add the import for the mouse, I'm going to implement all abstract methods. You remember it had mouse click, mouse press, mouse release, mouse entered, mouse exited. Now if I delete even one of those functions, it's going to generate an error. It's not abstract and does not override whichever method. So these abstract classes, there's some code that we get as part of it, but we have to override certain functions. We have to implement some of these functions, and that's why extends, we're just continuing on. Implement, we have to implement those particular functions. Oh, and recall, and I'm going to get rid of that, if we wanted our program to actually start listening for keyboard events or mouse events, we would say add key listener this to our program to actually start listening for events, or we would say add mouse listener this. Now that you understand what implements means, it's time, and you've probably guessed this, we're going to implement something to listen for buttons. Now you might guess it's button listener or widget listener. How Java treats widgets is that anytime something happens with a widget, it's called an action. So what we're going to do is we're going to implement action listener. We're going to have to add the import. And then again, we know all the functions that we had to implement for mouse listener and keyboard listener. I'm going to implement all the abstract methods for action listener. Let's see how many there are. There's just one, action performed. So now we've implemented action listener. Now before, when we wanted our program, if we ran our program right now, it's going to operate the same way, right? Even if I say inside my action performed, anytime an action happens, system.out.println, something is happening. Okay, so if I run my program again, you'll notice no matter what I do, nothing's going to pop up. Now, those of you that are on the ball are saying, well, just like our keyboard listener or our mouse listener, we have to say add key listener this to start to start listening for keyboard events, add mouse listener this to start listening for mouse events. We should say add action listener this to start listening for action events. You're very close. The difference is our JFrame is not going to be the one listening for these events. So what's going to be listening for these events are the individual widgets. So instead of adding the listeners, adding the listener to our JFrame, we can add it to particular widgets. So sometimes we don't want to listen for events from a particular widget for whatever reason. But in this case, I'm going to add action listener this. So I'm telling button B that there's an action listener, and it's this program, this widgets program, because it implemented action listener. So whenever there's an action event, somebody presses you basically, pass that event on to the widgets program, which will then pass it on to the action performed function. Now I'm going to add a couple action listeners. I'm going to say b2.add action listener this. Okay, so we've added action listeners to our two buttons. Now if I run my program and press it, you notice now we have something happening when we press on our buttons. It says something happened. Now, how can we differentiate between the two buttons? Maybe we want one thing to happen when button B is pressed. Maybe we want something else to happen when button B2 is pressed. Well, just like mouse listener, key listener that you've used before, there's an object that gets passed in that tells you something about the action event. The keyboard listener, for the key event, it told us what key was pressed. For the mouse listener, it told us where the mouse was pressed on the screen, stuff like that. So for our action event, if AE dot, the one we're going to use the most often is get source. And I'm going to say if get source equals button B, basically what that means is the source of the action event, the button that was clicked was button B, I want to do this. Otherwise, if AE.get source equals B2, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to say system.out.println, say rocks. Now if I run my program, not only do we have our GUI implemented, but we have our buttons listening for events, and we're able to distinguish. So if I press button 1, press me, something is happening. Button 2, Sasevich rocks, right? And I could even do stuff like b.set enabled equal to false, so that whenever button 2 is pressed, it disables button 1. So the only option the user now has is to acknowledge that SafeSwitch rocks. So we now know how to capture action events for our programs. I'm going to show you what an action event looks like for a text field. JF1. Okay, so we're going to try and print off the message text field event whenever the user types something into the text field. So again, our buttons work. When I start typing, you notice nothing happens. And I can type as long as I want here, but nothing's going to happen inside that text field until I actually hit enter. So once the user hits enter, then you have a text field event. If you want to capture something every time the user types something in, or if, for example, you wanted to use a slider widget, there's a different listener, there's a change listener that you would have to implement and use in that case. So there we go. That's the end of the graphical user interface unit. Your challenge today, there's an assignment where you're going to be playing around with some buttons, having your buttons actually do something. So look on the e-learning site for your assignment.